The last transmission from Colony Varda came at 3:12 station time. It was not a distress call. There was no time for one. It was 11 seconds of static, then a single voice of port worker from the sound of it saying, "They are already inside the," and then nothing. No signal. No follow-up. Just the dead sound of a channel that would never open again. That was how the war started. Not with a declaration. Not with an ultimatum. With 11 seconds and a sentence that no one ever got to finish. Commander Sable Dern heard the recording 4 times before she stopped replaying it. She was aboard Calyx Station, humanity's largest military hub, sitting at the edge of the outer reach where the colonies thinned out and deep space began. She had 31 warships under her watch, a full crew of 12,004 hours. Before the Riven Concord arrived at her door, the Riven Concord was not one species. It was many 7, to be exact, bound together by a single shared belief that humanity was spreading too fast, building too much, and one day would become something the rest of the galaxy could not stop. They had decided to stop it now, while they still could. They were not wrong to be afraid. They were only wrong about the timing. When the Concord fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel around Calyx Station, Sable had her ships in formation and her weapons hot. She fought for 71 hours. She lost 24 warships in the first day. By the second day, she was fighting with debris. By the third, she was giving the order to scatter and survive. Calyx Station fell at dawn on the 4th day, not because her crew stopped fighting. They never stopped. It fell because there was simply nothing left to fight with. Sable got out on a damaged transport with a crew of 40. She did not look back. Looking back would not have helped anyone. Across human space, the story was the same. The Concord had planned the attack for years. Every major human military position was hit within the same 6-hour window. Colony worlds went dark one after another. Varda, Meth Sola, the Bren Cluster, Port Aldous, Dusk Ring. 47 worlds, silent within a week. By the time Director Oren Vasek called an emergency session of the Earth Remnant Council, humanity had 11 functional warships left. 11 out of hundreds. The Council met inside a hollowed-out asteroid in the outer belt. No fixed location. No broadcast signal, no lights on the outside. Just rock floating in the dark, and inside it, 23 people trying to decide what came next. Vasek looked older than his years as he stood at the head of the table. He was a short man with gray at his temples and a habit of speaking slowly when things were bad, as if choosing each word carefully was the only control he had left. He laid out the situation without softening it. 47 colonies unreachable. The fleet gone. Earth itself under blockade. The Concord had sent a formal message: surrender within 40 days, or they would begin dismantling human infrastructure permanently. They called it corrective restructuring. Everyone in the room knew what it meant. Humanity would survive. It just would not be humanity anymore. Not really. 3 options were put forward. The first was full surrender. Vasek read the Concord's terms aloud. Cultural exchange programs that were, in truth, erasure programs. No. Independent military. No expansion. Humanity reduced to a managed species, kept small and quiet and watched. Counselor Bren called it a slow death dressed in paperwork. No one disagreed. The second option was to fight. Use the 11 ships. Rally whatever civilians could. Be armed. Make the Concord pay for every meter of human space they took. It would fail. Everyone knew it would fail. But it was honest, and some people around that table preferred honest failure to quiet surrender. The third option came from Scholar Idrin, and it silenced the room completely. Idrin was not a military man. He was old, thin, and had spent 40 years studying the history of alien civilizations, the ones that rose, and more importantly, the ones that ended. He had been quiet through the whole session, sitting at the far end of the table with a cup of cold water in front of him, listening. When he finally spoke, he said only one word first. The Drath. Nobody laughed. That was how serious things were. In any other circumstance, in any other room, someone would have laughed. The Drath were not a real option. The Drath were the thing you mentioned to frighten children, the species that other species spoke about in careful voices even when they were light years away. They were old in a way that made the rest of the galaxy feel new. They did not trade. They did not communicate. They did not involve themselves in anything. Except 3 times, in all of recorded history, they had. And each time, the species on the wrong side of that involvement had simply ceased to be a problem. No one had ever asked the draft for help. The historical record contained exactly 0 examples of a successful diplomatic contact. It did contain several examples of delegations that entered draft space and were never seen again. Idrin explained all of this clearly. He did not make it sound safe. He did not pretend there was no debt involved, no danger, no chance that whatever the draft asked in return would be worse than what the Concord offered. He simply said, "We have 40 days. This is the only option that is not already decided." The vote was close. It was the closest vote the council had ever taken. 12 in favor, 11 against, 1 abstention. Humanity decided, by a margin of 1 vote, to walk into the dark and ask the most frightening thing in the galaxy for help. Nobody slept well that night. Nobody volunteered to lead the delegation. That said everything. Eventually, Director Vasek asked Ambassador Reyes Sol because she was the best diplomat humanity had left alive, and because she did not say no when he asked her. She did not say yes either. She said, "I'll go," in the same flat tone someone uses when they step forward to fix a pipe that is flooding the floor, not from bravery, but because the water is rising and somebody has to move. Commander Sable Dern was assigned to pilot the flagship. 3 ships total. 30. Crew across all of them. Scholar Idrin came along because he knew more about the draft than anyone alive, which was not saying much, but it was something. Before they left, Idrin gave everyone the same 3 rules he had pulled from old records and broken fragments of lost alien texts. First, do not lie to the draft. Not even a small lie. Not even a polite one. Second, do not perform strength you do not have. They will know. Third, if they speak to you, answer only what is true. Sable asked him how anyone knew these rules if no delegation had ever come back. Idrin said some records came back even when the people did not. They crossed into the region called the Morning Veil 9 days after leaving the outer belt. The Morning Veil was a stretch of space where several old stars had died long ago. What remained was cold, dark, and very quiet. No planets. No debris. Worth noting, just the leftover gravity of things that used to shine and did not anymore. It felt, to the crew, like passing through a place where something large had once stood and left without cleaning up. The instruments read normal. Temperature, radiation, pressure, all standard. But every person on the ship felt it. A weight behind the eyes. A sense that the dark outside was not empty. That it was full of something patient and very, very old. They traveled for 2 more days into the veil. Then the ships stopped moving. Not from engine failure. The engines were still running. The ships simply stopped. As if the space itself had decided they had gone far enough. Sable ran every check. She knew. Everything showed green. They were just not moving. Then the draft ships appeared. There was no moment of them arriving. They were not there, and then they were. 12 vessels surrounding the 3 human ships in a loose formation. They were black, each one enormous, with no lights, no visible weapons, no signal, no markings of any kind. They looked less like ships and more like pieces of the dark that had decided to hold a shape. 3 days passed. No communication. Nothing. The crew did not sleep well. Some did not sleep at all. Reyes spent those 3 days sitting in the small communications room, rereading the speech she had prepared, crossing out lines, rewriting, crossing out again. By the 3rd day, the paper had more crossings than words. On the morning of the 4th day, 1 message came through. No sender identified. No signal trace. It appeared in the communications log as if it had always been there. And someone had only just noticed. 1 word, speak. Rhea put down her paper. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk. Then she opened a channel, and she spoke not the speech she had prepared, not the careful diplomatic version with its softened edges and strategic silences. She told the truth. She said humanity had been proud and loud and had expanded fast without asking what the rest of the galaxy thought. She said the Concord had come and taken nearly everything in less than 2 weeks. She said 11 warships remained. She said. 47 colony worlds were silent, and she did not know how many people were still alive on them. She said humanity was going to be erased if nothing changed, and that the Concord's version of mercy was the kind that left nothing worth saving. She said. They had come because there was no one else left to come to. She did not call it an appeal to justice. She did not call it a shared interest in galactic stability. She said, we are losing and we do not want to disappear, and you are the only ones we know of who could change that. When she finished, the room was quiet. Then someone was standing in the corridor outside. No door had opened. No transport signal. No sound. Sable had been watching the corridor camera from the bridge, and she had not blinked, and still she had not seen it happen. One moment the corridor was empty. The next, something was there. It was tall, thin in a way that did not look fragile, more like something that did not need to be large to be dangerous. Its surface was dark, not quite skin and not quite armor. Its face had no expression that any human frame of reference could read. It stood completely still, the way only things that have never been nervous stand still. Rhea walked out to meet it. Her hands were shaking. She did not try to hide it. The draft looked at her. It said, in perfect and unaccented human standard, what have you already sacrificed? She told it. Every colony, every ship, every life she knew of, and many she did not. It said, what will you sacrifice still? She said, whatever we have to. The draft speaker Ur, though she did not know his name, yet was quiet for a long time. Then he said, we will deliberate. You will wait. And he was gone, the same way he had arrived. No sound, no movement, just absence. Rhea went back into the communications room and sat down. Outside, the black ships had not moved. The veil pressed against every window. 37 days remained before the Concord's deadline. She picked up her pen and did not write anything. Waiting is its own kind of war. The draft ships did not move. They did not signal. They gave no indication that anything was being decided at all. For all any human aboard those 3 vessels could tell, the ships outside were simply decoration, enormous, lightless, silent. Decoration hung in the dark of the morning veil like warnings left by something that had passed through long ago. By day 5 of the wait, Sable Dern had organized the crew into shifts, assigned maintenance tasks to keep hands busy, and started eating her meals standing up, because sitting still made her feel like she was already buried. She had been a soldier for 19 years. She understood waiting before a fight. She did not understand this waiting for something that might not come, for a decision being made by minds she could not begin to model. Scholar Idrin helped, in the way that explaining a terrifying thing sometimes makes it slightly less terrifying. He had brought every record he could find, fragments, translations of translations, second-hand accounts from species who had observed the draft from what they hoped was a safe distance. He spread them across a table in the ship's small research space and went through them with Sable over 3 days, building the clearest picture anyone had ever assembled of what the draft actually were. The first thing he told her was that the draft were not many. They were one. Not one body, many bodies, but one mind, distributed across all of them. Every draft that existed was part of a single continuous thought. There were no individuals, no leaders in the way humans understood leadership. Warlord Kosh commanded the war. Fleets not because he outranked others, but because that part of the mind had been shaped for war, the way a hand is shaped for gripping. Speaker Ur spoke to other species for the same reason. He was the part of the draft mind that had been grown for language. This was why they deliberated. A decision made by the whole mind could not be made quickly, not in human terms. Every part had to process, weigh, and arrive at the same conclusion. But once that conclusion was reached, Idrin explained, it had never, in any recorded case, been reversed. Not once. Not for any reason. The draft did not reconsider. They did not negotiate after deciding. Whatever they were choosing right now, in those 12 black ships, would be final. Sable asked what they had decided before. The 3 times they had intervened. Idrin told her. The first was a species called the Veth, who had been conducting something the galactic community could only translate as a campaign of deliberate extinction against a smaller species. The draft intervened. The Veth did not fight back, not because they were unable to, but because within days of Drath arrival, no Veth soldier would leave their ship. No one gave orders. No one responded. The Veth military sat in its ships and did nothing until the smaller species it had been attacking was able to recover and build walls the Veth never tried to cross again. The second and third cases were similar. No explosions. No armies destroyed. Just a quiet removal of will of the drive to continue whatever the Drath had decided must stop. No one knew how it was done. Every instrument that had ever been trained on Drath ships during these events recorded nothing unusual. The affected species reported no pain, no hallucinations, no external force. They simply stopped wanting to do the thing the Drath had decided they could not do. Sable sat with that for a long time. Then she asked about the debt. Idrin's face did something careful when she asked. He said the historical record was not clear on the specifics, but the pattern was consistent. Any species the Drath owed something. Not money, not territory, not military service, nothing that simple. The Drath would decide what was owed, when it was owed, and what form it took. They would collect it at a time of their choosing. He said this was probably why no species had ever asked the Drath for help twice. Not because the debt was impossible to survive, but because no one knew what it would be until it was asked for, and the uncertainty of an undefined debt owed to a species that could not be refused was, for most civilizations, worse than the problem they had originally faced. Sable asked Idrin if he thought humanity had made a mistake. He said he did not know. He said there was a difference between a mistake and a necessary risk, and he was not certain which this was yet. That night, Sable was alone in the forward observation deck, watching the Drath ships float in the dark outside, when Ur appeared behind her. She had stopped being surprised by how he arrived. She turned around and looked at him. He said, "The deliberation is close to its end." She said, and he did not answer that. Instead, he said, "We have been watching your species for a long time, longer than you have been watching the stars." She asked him what that meant. He said nothing more. He was simply gone, the way he always left, between one breath and the next. On day 28, every Drath ship in the morning veil went dark at exactly the same moment. Not dark as in powered down, dark as in unreachable by any instrument, any signal, any scan, as if they had stopped existing in any way that could be measured. The crew waited in silence. For hours later, a message appeared in the communication log. No sender, no signal trace, just the words, clean and plain and final. "The debt is accepted. We will come." The Drath escorted the 3 human ships back to the outer belt without ceremony. No words were spoken. No course was given. The black ships simply began to move. And the 3 human vessels followed because the alternative was to stay alone in the morning veil, and nobody wanted that. At the edge of Drath territory, the escort stopped. The human ships crossed the boundary. When Sable looked back on the rear cameras, the Drath ships were already gone. Back at the asteroid base, Vasek and the remaining council were waiting. They had been waiting for 28 days with no news and a countdown clock running on every screen. 9 days left before the Concorde's deadline. Rhea told them what had happened. Vasek asked what "we will come" meant in practical terms. How many ships, in what direction, on what timeline? Rhea said she did not know. Nobody knew. That was the nature of dealing with the Drath. You did not get a plan. You got a fact, and then you waited to see what the fact produced. What it produced was this. On the morning of day 29, every communication network in Riven Concorde space went silent. Not jammed, not disrupted. Silent. Every relay, every long-range channel, every short-range ship-to-ship line across 17 star systems gone, simultaneously. At the same moment, with no warning and no explanation. The Concorde's admirals could not talk to each other. Their commanders could not receive orders. Their fleets, built for coordinated precision, went suddenly and completely blind. The first human probe data came back 6 hours later, fragmented and partial, but enough to understand what was happening. The Drath were inside the Concorde's formations. Not approaching, not at the edge of scanner range, moving inward. Inside, already there, positioned between ships. In the gaps of defensive formations, sitting in the exact spaces that should have been empty. Every Concord commander who filed a report in the brief window before communications died described it the same way in their own language. The ships were already there, as if they had been there always and had simply chosen to be seen. The Concord was not a small force. They had assembled over 400 warships to dismantle humanity, and those ships were still operational, still crewed, still armed. Under any normal circumstances, against any species the Concord had ever encountered, that fleet could have fought. But fighting requires someone to fire first. Admiral Drevos, the Concord's commanding mind, the one who had designed the entire offensive against humanity, who had coordinated the simultaneous strikes across 47 colony worlds, tried to give the order to engage. The record of this came from one of his aides who survived and later gave a full account to human historians. Drevos gave the order. His communications officer tried to transmit it, then stopped. Not because the system failed. The aide said the officer just stopped. Put her hands down. Stared at the screen. When Drevos asked what she was doing, she said she did not know. She said she could not remember what she was supposed to do next. This spread across every Concord ship near a draft vessel. The crews began to slow. Not collapsing, not in pain, not distressed, just slowing. Hands not moving to controls they had used 1,000 times before. Eyes unfocused. Minds going somewhere. That was not the task in front of them. There were no screams, no alarms, no weapons. Fire. Just the quiet unwinding of purpose. The Concord's fleet did not fight. It drifted. The one data capture of Warlord Kosh's flagship came from a human probe that had been left behind in Concord space months before the war and had gone undetected. It recorded the flagship for 11 seconds before the probe went dark. The ship was enormous, larger than any station humanity had ever built. It had no lights, no visible weapon systems, no markings. It moved through the middle of a Concord battle group at close range, and nothing on either side fired a single shot. In 9 days, the Riven Concord's military capability ceased to function. No planets were destroyed. No ships were reduced to wreckage. No bodies floated in space. The Concord's forces simply stopped being a force. Their ships were intact. Their crews were alive. They had simply lost, completely and without recovery, the drive to continue. Ships began drifting back toward home space without orders. Weapons systems were found powered down by crews who could not explain when or why they had done it. On day 38, the Concord's civilian leadership sent a formal message of unconditional surrender. It was not addressed to humanity. It was addressed to the draft. The draft did not respond. The Concord sent the message again and again. They tried 17 different frequencies. They sent physical courier vessels toward draft space. The couriers came back. They had not been stopped. There had simply been nothing there to receive the message. The draft ships were gone. Vasek read the surrender declaration 3 times to make sure he was reading it correctly. Then he sat back and was quiet for a long time. Sable was standing by the window of the asteroid base's small observation room, looking at nothing in particular, when Rhea came and stood beside her. Rhea said, "It's over." Sable said, "No, something is over. I don't think it's the part that matters." Outside, there was only the outer belt rock and dust and the dark. Somewhere behind it, 47 colony worlds were waiting to be found. 11 warships were waiting for orders. And somewhere else, in a direction that no human chart quite captured, the Drath were moving toward whatever they had decided came next. The debt had been accepted. The war had ended. The two facts sat side by side like doors, and no one yet knew which one mattered more. 47 colony worlds. 43 of them answered when humanity called back. 4 did not. Those 4 stayed silent for reasons that search teams would spend years untangling. 2 had suffered infrastructure damage too severe to maintain signal arrays. 1 had developed a local government that did not yet trust any signal from outside, and 1 was simply gone in a way that nobody on the investigation team wanted to put plain words to in their reports. But 43 worlds answered. People were alive. Systems were damaged. Economies were collapsed. Trust was broken in ways that would not be fixed in any single generation. But the people were there, and they answered, and that was the thing that mattered when Vasek stood before the full broadcast array 3 months after the Concorde's dissolution and spoke to every corner of human space still able to receive him. He did not use the word victory. He was careful about that. He said the word survival 3 times, deliberately, and he let it sit without dressing it up. He said humanity had made a decision in a dark room with no good options, and he was not going to pretend the decision had been clean or safe, or that its full consequences were yet known. He said a debt existed. He said he did not know what form it would take. He said the people of humanity deserved to know that, and that he believed they were capable of facing it, because they had already faced the thing before it. Some people were angry at the speech. They wanted triumph. They wanted the language of winning. Vasek gave them the language of honest men, and for a while, that was unpopular. Later, most people came to understand it was the only kind of language worth giving. The Riven Concorde dissolved in the months that followed. The 7 species that had formed it scattered back to their own spaces, their own concerns, their own internal arguments about what had happened and who was responsible. Several of them sent quiet diplomatic messages to humanity, careful, formal messages full of the kind of language that means we would like to pretend the recent past did not happen and start again if you are willing. Humanity, being humanity, mostly was willing. Not because the wounds were gone. They were not gone. But because holding a grudge against 7 species while also managing a debt to the Drath and rebuilding 43 colony worlds was more than anyone could do at once, and people are, when they have no other choice, practical. Rhea's soul wrote a personal message to Ur. Not official correspondence she had. No template for official correspondence with the Drath. Just a message, written the way she would write to someone she had met once in a strange place and was not sure she would ever see again. She told him that humanity was rebuilding. She told him. She thought about the morning veil sometimes, in the early mornings, when things were quiet. She said she did not know if he read messages sent into empty space, but that she thought he deserved to know the people he had helped were still here and still working. 3 weeks later, a message appeared in her personal communication log with no origin point, no signal path, no timestamp. 3 words, you did well. She did not tell many people about it. She kept the message. She looked at it. Sometimes when the rebuilding felt slow and the debt felt heavy and the future felt like a wall with no door. Sable Dern returned to Calix Station 6 months after the war ended, assigned to oversee the reconstruction effort. What remained of the station was a metal skeleton and a lot of floating debris, but the skeleton was enough to build from, and the engineers said it could be done. It would take years. It would take resources humanity was barely beginning to accumulate again. She arrived by shuttle and came through the docking arm that still functioned, and she looked out through the nearest intact window at the space above the station. A Drath ship was there. One ship, alone, holding position above Calix Station in a way that was not quite orbiting and not quite hovering, just present, the way the Drath always seemed to be, without urgency and without explanation. She hailed it through every frequency. She had no response. She ran scans. The scans returned no useful data. The ship simply sat there, enormous and dark and patient, and did nothing. She asked the station's communications team how long it had been there. They checked the logs. It had been there before she arrived, possibly since shortly after the war ended. They had been filing reports about it to the Council for months, and the Council's official position was that it was observing and presented no threat, and that humanity's current policy toward uninvited Drath presence was to not do anything that might constitute a provocation. Sable looked at the ship for a long time. Scholar Idrin published his new historical paper near the end of that year. It was long and carefully written and received a great deal of attention. It covered the full history of Drath interactions with other species, what records existed of the debts called in the past, and what limited conclusions could be drawn from the pattern. His final line was the only part most people quoted. For the first time in recorded history, a species has survived asking the Drath for help. What humanity does with the borrowed future it now holds remains to be seen. Sable read that line standing on the observation deck of a half-rebuilt Calix station. with a Drath ship sitting silently above her head. She was not afraid of it anymore. That was not the same as being comfortable with it. It was something smaller and more useful than comfort. It was the understanding that the ship being there was a fact, the debt being owed was a fact, and that facts are things you work with, not things you escape. The station was being built back up around her. People were moving in the corridors. Below, somewhere out there, 43 worlds were doing the same. The debt would come. She did not know when. She did not know what it would ask. She went back to work. The message came on a Tuesday. Nobody expected that the mundane detail of it. The way it arrived between a budget review and a lunch that Rhea's soul never got to eat. It appeared in her private communication log at 11:43 station time. The same way yours messages always appeared. No origin, no signal path, no timestamp. That matched any clock anyone could check. It said, "Send your finest minds. Bring nothing else." Rhea read it twice. Then she sent one message to Vasek and one to Sable, and by the time she had finished her coffee, the process of assembling 12 people had already begun. They took the selection seriously. Scientists, historians, 2 linguists who had spent their careers studying dead alien languages, an engineer who had once rebuilt a communications array from components it was not designed to use, a botanist whose presence nobody questioned because Vasek had insisted on her, and he would not say why. Sable Dern put her own name on the list and told Vasek she was going. He did not argue. He knew the look on her face. Rhea led. She always led. They gathered on a single ship, the same class of vessel that had gone into the Morning Veil the first time, and they crossed into Drath space at the edge where the border had no marker and was only known because instruments always started behaving strangely just past a certain point. Ur did not meet them at the border. He met them much further in a region no human chart showed at all, around a star that had collapsed into something cool and dim and slow, putting out just enough light to make the space around it feel like late evening in a building with one window. The star had no name on any record. It orbited nothing and nothing orbited it, as far as instruments could tell. Except one world. It was small and pale. From orbit, it looked like something made of old ice, flat and featureless, until they got closer and saw the surface was not ice at all. It was glass. Not natural glass. Shaped glass, smooth in some places, broken in others, stretching across the landscape in formations that followed no geological logic but followed some other logic that none of the scientists on the ship could name yet. Under the glass, when the light hit it right, there were things, shapes, lines. Something had been written there, in a medium that had survived whatever had destroyed the rest. They landed. The air was breathable. That detail unnerved more than a few people. That a world around a dying star with no visible reason to support life had air. That humans could breathe without equipment. No one said what they were thinking. That the Drath might have made it that way. That the Drath might have known humanity was coming here long before humanity did. Ur was on the surface when they came down, standing in the ruins, which were visible from the ground, now low structures, mostly collapsed, made of the same glassy material as the ground, with the same lines and shapes covering every surface that had not crumbled to powder. He spoke for longer than he had ever spoken to any human. He said the Drath had found this place before the oldest living species in the galaxy had been born, before most current stars had ignited. A species had lived here and built here and thought here, and then they were gone, not destroyed, not displaced. Just gone in the way that some things go, completely and without remainder, except for what they had written on the ground of their world in glass that did not break. The Drath had been reading it for a very long time. They had not been able to. Sable asked why. She asked it plainly, the way she asked everything. Ur was quiet for longer than felt comfortable. Then he said, because it was written by something that was not afraid. We do not know what that is. The humans stood with that for a moment. The Drath, who unmade the will of armies without weapons, who moved through space, like something the universe had been waiting for, who had never reversed a decision, and never failed at anything any living species had ever observed they could not. Red writing left by something unafraid, because they had no reference for it. Nothing in their experience, in their long and absolute and terrible history, helped. them understand a mind that operated without fear as its foundation. But humans did. Humans were afraid all the time. They were afraid, and they did things anyway. They were afraid, and they asked for help anyway. They were afraid, and they sat down in the ruins of dead civilizations and tried to understand what had been left behind. The species that had written on this glass world had done it without fear, and the only minds in the galaxy that might bridge that gap were the ones that knew fear from the inside and had learned to work around it. This was the debt, not service, not territory, not a war fought on the Drath's behalf. The debt was this: sit down and read, and do not stop until you understand. The 12 humans spread out across the ruins. The two linguists began photographing every surface they could reach. The historians started building a catalog. The engineer walked the perimeter, mapping structural patterns, noting repetitions that might be grammar or might be architecture or might be something with no human word for it yet. Rhea sat down on a flat piece of glass and put her hand on the surface and felt the lines beneath her palm and thought about 11 seconds of static and a voice that never got to finish its sentence, and about how far that moment was from this one, and how strange the distance felt. Sable stood at the edge of the ruins and looked up. Above her, in a sky that was the color of old pewter, she could see the shapes of Drath ships holding position, not threatening, not hovering, just there, the way they always were. Watching, she looked back down at the glass under her feet. Lines and shapes, a whole language, of something that had not been afraid. She knelt and took out a recording device and started documenting the section of ground. Beneath her, it would take years, possibly longer. Possibly it would take more than her lifetime, and the people who finished it would be people she would never meet. That was fine. That was how the long things worked. Rhea's recorded message went back to Earth that evening. Her voice was calm and clear. We are beginning. It is enough.